The punch connected with nothing but air, and Jackie's left foot slipped backward on what seemed like an invisible patch of something slick. From where the man in row 7 sat, clutching a worn ticket stub between his thumb and forefinger, it looked like the kind of mistake that could shatter everything. The scene, the film, maybe even a career. If you've ever wondered how a single moment can change everything you think you know about someone, this story might surprise you. The projector beam cut through cigarette haze like a second-hand marking time, and in that amber light, Jackie appeared to hover for just an instant, suspended between control and catastrophe. The man had been coming to this small Hong Kong cinema for 3 years, always choosing the same seat when he could, always keeping his ticket stubs in a small wooden box at home. He noticed things others missed, the way conversations died when certain actors appeared on screen, how a room could hold its breath without anyone asking it to. He remembered the first time he'd walked into this particular theater, drawn by the promise of a new kind of action film that people were talking about in hushed, excited tones. The lobby had been thick with the smell of fresh popcorn and old carpet, and the walls were covered with hand-painted posters that seemed to promise something different from the usual kung fu fare. The ticket booth attendant, a woman with graying hair and paint-stained fingers, had looked at him knowingly when he'd asked for a seat in the middle section. "First time seeing this young man fight?" she'd asked, and when he nodded, she'd smiled. "You'll want to be able to see his face. That's where the real action happens." That night 3 years ago, he hadn't understood what she meant. He'd been expecting the usual display of kicks and punches, the kind of choreographed violence that left audiences cheering but rarely thinking. Instead, he'd watched Jackie Chan move through fight scenes like he was having conversations with his opponents, each gesture seeming to say something specific, each pause loaded with meaning he couldn't quite decipher but somehow felt in his chest. The man's name was Liu Wei, though he'd never spoken it aloud in this theater, and he worked for a shipping company that moved goods between Hong Kong and the mainland. His days were spent checking manifests, verifying container contents, ensuring that every item that left the port had proper documentation. It was precise work that demanded attention to detail, and he'd grown to appreciate the way small errors could cascade into larger problems if not caught early. Perhaps that's why he noticed things in films that other viewers missed, the micro-expressions that preceded major plot points, the way background music shifted half a beat before significant dialogue, the subtle changes in an actor's posture that telegraphed what was coming next. Tonight, however, something felt different from the moment the opening credits began to roll. The usual crowd was there. The construction workers who came straight from their job sites, still smelling of concrete dust and sweat. The office clerks like himself, who used these evening shows to decompress from days spent hunched over paperwork. The teenagers on dates who whispered and laughed through quieter scenes, but fell silent during action sequences. But there was an electricity in the air that Liu Wei had learned to recognize, the kind of communal anticipation that meant everyone sensed they were about to witness something special. Tonight felt different from the moment Jackie's character entered the warehouse fight scene. The usual sounds were there. Candy wrappers crinkling as nervous fingers sought distraction. Someone's chair spring squeaking with each lean forward. The distant hum of the projector threading celluloid dreams through mechanical precision. But underneath it all, something electric seemed to be building. The way the air changes before a thunderstorm, without any visible clouds. Liu Wei had felt this sensation before, though rarely in a movie theater. Once, years earlier, he'd been working late at the shipping office when a massive container ship had lost power while entering the harbor. From his window, he'd watched the vessel drift toward the pier with what appeared to be inevitable disaster approaching in slow motion. The entire office had gone silent, not because anyone had announced the crisis, but because sometimes collective intuition picks up frequencies that individual awareness misses. That's what was happening now in this small cinema. 200 people sensing that something significant was building, though none could explain exactly what it was. The warehouse set was larger than most Hong Kong productions could afford, with towering stacks of wooden crates and industrial lighting that cast dramatic shadows across concrete floors. Jackie's character was supposed to be infiltrating some kind of smuggling operation, though the plot details seemed less important than the physical poetry of watching him move through the environment. He'd already demonstrated his signature style in earlier scenes. The way he used everyday objects as weapons, how he could make a folding chair or a paint, can seem like it had been designed specifically for combat. But this scene was building towards something different. The choreography was more complex, involving multiple opponents and levels of the set that required precise timing. Liu Wei could see it in the way the camera lingered on certain objects. A rope hanging from a pulley system, a stack of barrels positioned just so, a patch of what looked like spilled motor oil near the loading dock entrance. These weren't random set decorations. They were elements in a puzzle that Jackie's character would need to solve with his body. The slip happened so quickly that most viewers might have missed it entirely. But Liu Wei's trained eye, honed by years of watching for irregularities in shipping manifests, caught every microsecond of the sequence. Jackie's character was supposed to dodge a wooden crate swinging toward his head, pivot left on his right foot while maintaining perfect balance, then drive an elbow into his opponent's ribs with the kind of precision that made violence look like choreographed dancing. It was standard choreography for what should have been a standard fight scene in what was becoming an extraordinary film. Instead, his left foot found what looked like a small puddle of spilled soda or motor oil, the kind of set hazard that any experienced stunt coordinator should have caught during rehearsals. Physics took over with ruthless efficiency. For maybe half a second, Jackie's body tilted at an angle that had nothing to do with martial arts, and everything to do with gravity asserting its fundamental authority over even the most skilled human form. From his seat in row 7, Liu Wei felt his own body responding involuntarily. His left hand gripped the armrest, while his right hand squeezed the ticket stub so tightly that his fingernail left a small crescent impression in the paper. Around him, he could sense the collective intake of breath that happens when an audience realizes they're witnessing something unscripted, something real breaking through the carefully constructed fiction they'd paid to see. The woman 2 rows back, a middle-aged office worker who Liu Wei had seen at several previous showings, stopped mid-chew on her gum, her jaw frozen in an expression that suggested she was trying to process whether this was part of the story or a mistake that would ruin it. A teenage couple in the front row leaned forward simultaneously, their whispered conversation cutting off mid-sentence. Someone's drink bottle, halfway to their lips, paused in midair as if the owner had forgotten the basic mechanics of drinking. In that moment, the invisible fourth wall that separates audience from performance became almost visible, a membrane stretched thin and threatening to tear. This was the kind of moment that could destroy the careful illusion that filmmakers work so hard to create, the instant when everyone remembers they're watching actors on a set rather than characters in a story. Liu Wei had seen it happen before in live theater, when an actor forgot a line or a prop malfunctioned and the entire production had to recover from the sudden reminder that nothing they were watching was real. But Jackie's reaction to finding himself off balance was unlike anything Liu Wei had witnessed in his years of watching both live and filmed performance. There was no visible panic, no rushed attempt to regain footing that would have signaled to everyone that something had gone wrong. Instead, something far more interesting began to unfold. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Though Liu Wei knew the film itself never changed speed, he'd become familiar enough with this theater's projection equipment to recognize when reels were running at anything other than standard 24 frames per second. The temporal distortion was happening in his own perception, and apparently in the perception of everyone around him, as if the entire audience had collectively decided to pay closer attention to this particular sequence of seconds. Instead of scrambling to regain his footing with the kind of panicked flailing that would have immediately signaled a mistake, instead of rushing to cover the error with quick movement that might have salvaged the choreography but destroyed the authenticity of the moment, Jackie simply stopped. Not completely. His arms continued their defensive position, suggesting his character was still aware of the ongoing threat. His breathing remained controlled and visible in the way his chest moved beneath his shirt. His eyes stayed focused on his opponent with the kind of predatory awareness that suggested the fight wasn't over. But for what felt like 3 full seconds, though Liu Wei's rational mind told him it was probably closer to 1.5, Jackie held that off-balance position as if it had been planned all along, as if this moment of vulnerability was exactly what the scene had been building toward from the moment his character had entered the warehouse. During those eternal seconds, the acoustic environment of the theater transformed in ways that Liu Wei found fascinating. Sounds that had been part of the background noise of any crowded space suddenly became individual, distinct elements that seemed amplified by the collective attention focused on them. A candy wrapper that someone had been slowly unwrapping, probably trying to be considerate of their neighbors, suddenly sounded like paper being torn with deliberate violence. The squeak from the chair spring, which had been providing a rhythmic accompaniment to someone's nervous shifting, became almost musical in its regularity, like a metronome marking time in a universe where time had become negotiable. Someone in the back of the theater cleared their throat, and the sound echoed with the clarity of a gunshot in the absolute hush that had fallen over 200 people who had suddenly become unified in their attention. Even the building itself seemed to be listening. The usual subtle groans of settling wood and metal that provided the unconscious soundtrack of any older structure had gone quiet, as if the theater's architecture was holding its breath along with its occupants. Liu Wei found himself studying Jackie's face on the 30-foot screen, looking for the micro-expressions that would reveal how he was processing this unexpected moment. In his work at the shipping office, he'd learned to read faces when problems arose. The way people's expressions shifted when they realized a container had been misrouted, or when they discovered that documentation didn't match cargo, or when they understood that a mistake was going to cost time and money, and possibly reputation. But instead of the frustration or embarrassment or quick calculation he expected to see, he observed something that looked remarkably like consideration. Jackie's eyes seemed to be measuring not just the physical distance between himself and his opponent, not just the angle of his own body relative to the ground, but something more abstract. Timing, possibility, the way this unplanned moment might actually serve the story better than whatever had been originally choreographed. Then came the moment that people would talk about in the lobby afterward, that would follow some of them home and into conversations with friends who hadn't been there. Jackie didn't just regain his balance, he transformed the slip into something that looked like it belonged in the fight. One controlled step backward, a fluid shift of weight, and suddenly his off-balance position became a defensive crouch that made perfect sense for dodging the next punch that was coming his way. The technique wasn't in any martial arts manual the man knew of, and he'd been watching kung fu films long enough to recognize most of the standard moves. This was something else entirely. Improvisation that looked so natural, it made everything that came before it seem like setup. The near fall became a feint. The slip became strategy. The change in the audience was immediate and strange to witness. The nervous energy that had filled the room during those 3 seconds of uncertainty transformed into something deeper. The laughter that began wasn't mocking. It was the kind of relieved appreciation that comes when someone pulls off something impossible. But then the laughter shifted again, becoming quieter, more respectful. The man could feel people around him settling back into their seats with a different kind of attention than they'd had before. Where moments earlier, they'd been consuming the action, cheering, eating, talking. Now they were watching. Really watching. The difference felt palpable in the warm air of the small theater. It was as if Jackie had reminded everyone that there was a real person behind the character, someone who could make mistakes and then make those mistakes into art. The fight scene continued for another 4 minutes, but the man found himself less interested in the punches and kicks than in studying the faces around him. The woman who had stopped chewing her gum was now leaning forward with her chin resting on her hand. A teenage boy, who had been sprawled carelessly in his seat, was sitting up straight. Even the man's own breathing had changed, becoming more deliberate, more focused. When the scene ended and the film moved to quieter dialogue, the spell seemed to break gradually. Conversations resumed in whispers, candy wrappers returned to their crinkling, chairs began squeaking again with normal movement. But something had shifted in the room's energy that didn't quite return to what it had been before. After the credits rolled and the lights came up, the man remained in his seat longer than usual, letting most of the crowd file out before him. In the lobby, he could hear fragments of conversation, people trying to describe what they'd witnessed, struggling to put words to the moment when mistake became mastery. Someone used the word magic. Another person kept saying, "Did you see when he just stopped?" as if repetition might help explain it. Standing outside the theater under the neon glow of Hong Kong street signs, the man carefully folded his ticket stub and placed it in his wallet. He'd been saving stubs for 3 years, but this one felt different, heavier somehow, as if it carried more weight than just the memory of a film. Walking home through narrow streets that smelled of street food and motor oil, he found himself thinking about the 3 seconds when Jackie had simply held still. Most people would have rushed to cover the mistake, would have let panic drive them toward quick fixes and hasty movements. Instead, Jackie had given himself time to think, to feel where his body was in space, to understand what the moment was offering him. The man had worked in an office for 15 years, handling shipping manifests and inventory reports. His was a life of careful precision, of double-checking figures and maintaining order. He understood the value of control, of making sure everything stayed in its proper place. But watching Jackie transform chaos into art had shown him something he hadn't considered before. Sometimes the most powerful kind of control was knowing when to let something unexpected become part of the plan. Years later, long after he'd moved to a different district and found a new cinema closer to his apartment, the man would still carry that ticket stub in his wallet. The numbers had faded, and the paper had softened to the texture of cloth, but he kept it there between his driver's license and a photo of his daughter. Sometimes, when he was stressed at work or frustrated with how something in his life was going wrong, he would touch the edge of that stub through the leather of his wallet and remember those 3 seconds. What he came to understand during quiet moments when he thought about that night was that he hadn't just kept a piece of paper. He'd preserved a lesson about what mastery actually looked like. It wasn't about never making mistakes. Everyone slipped. Everyone found themselves off balance at some point. True skill was in what you did with the slip once it happened. Jackie had shown him that the most powerful moments weren't always the planned ones. Sometimes they were the spaces between the plan and the execution, the pauses where you had to decide whether to fight against what was happening or find a way to make it work for you. In 3 seconds on a movie screen, a near fall had become poetry, and a mistake had taught 200 people something about grace under pressure that they might never have learned otherwise. The man often wondered what other lessons might be hidden in moments that looked like failures at first glance. How many times had he rushed to fix something that might have taught him more if he'd just paused to understand it first? How many mistakes had he covered up instead of transforming them into something useful? But there was something else that stayed with him from that night, something that would surface in his thoughts whenever he heard Jackie's name in later years. If Jackie could change an entire room's understanding of what was possible with just 3 seconds of perfect stillness on a movie screen, what might he have accomplished in real life when the stakes weren't applause but actual survival? What kind of control did someone like that have when cameras weren't rolling and the only audience was danger itself?